Chapter 9, Pascola Masks. My legs were red and swollen. The lotion Zuleika had given me for the flea bites had not helped one bit. On the contrary, something in it seemed to make the bites even more virulent. It reminded me of the time I had had chickenpox as a child, only now, I was far more uncomfortable. What did Zuleika give me that knocked me out? I asked Carlos as we were driving to Vickham Station. Cocoa. You mean there was only cocoa powder in that drink? I don't believe it. Carlos nodded. She thought you liked hot chocolate. That it would take your mind off the bites. I do like it, but it never affected me like that before. What affected you was Zuleika's art of mesmerism, he explained. She can move a person's center of awareness with her dream body. All she has to do is to look you in the eyes, or touch your forehead, or the back of your neck or shoulder blade, and you'll go out like a light. Are you sure there was nothing in the drink? I insisted. Absolutely. She doesn't need to resort to using drugs or potions. Zuleika is a sorceress of the highest caliber. The Nawal Julian taught her himself. She has an affinity for you because you are like her, quite a bit crazy. Someday, she'll show you her art. What might that be? I asked, knocking people out with a pat on the back. Carlos pulled down the visor of the car to shield himself from the sun's glare. Zuleika is a consummate dreamer. She stalks with her dream body. When you meet her again, she'll teach you how to stalk with the double. What is stalking with the double? I asked. You'll have to wait until Zuleika shows you, Carlos said. She's the master of it. As I've said, she learned from the Nawal Julian, and from someone else in our lineage. Who was this other person? A sorcerer of unending accomplishments. All I can tell you is that Don Juan's lineage is indebted to this person, just as he is indebted to our lineage. I wanted to ask more about this mysterious personage and about Zuleika's art, but we had already arrived at Vickham Station. Benny was waiting in front of his house. When he saw our car, he hopped in and said he knew of several people who might have masks for sale. He offered to accompany us so that we would not get lost. At first, I thought he was just being polite or wanted the company of his friend, but when I saw that an ordinary rock was a signpost, or a cactus indicated a turn onto a road, it was evident that we needed the guidance of someone who knew the terrain to perfection. It would be impossible to find anyone's house or store unless one had been there before, sometimes, even then. For, even with Benny in the car, we had to backtrack on several occasions to catch a missed turn onto a road that was barely visible. We drove across the highway and veered off onto a road that, according to Benny, would take us to Potham, where Don Felipe, a mask carver, lived. It was a feat just to find a particular house, for they all looked alike. The typical house had plated cane walls, sometimes coated heavily with mud, and a roof composed of layers of cane resting on a few mesquite rafters with earth piled on top of the cane. Construction materials included adobe brick, cane with mesquite support posts and rafters. Sometimes, I could see mats of split cane serving as part of the roof. All the houses had 2 or 3 rooms and had a ramada which consisted of a roof supported on crooked mesquite posts. Besides offering protection from the sun, the ramada served as a storage area for herbs and corn that were placed on top of it to dry. The houses were surrounded by fences, 5 or 6 feet high, made of plaited cane, which sometimes afforded people complete privacy. I saw corrals with an occasional goat, pig or donkey, and, of course, chickens and the scrawniest dogs south of the border. Everywhere I could smell burning mesquite wood from kitchen fires. What struck me was that, except for the occasional barking of a dog or the cawing of a crow, everything was quiet. I couldn't help notice the sharp contrast from the noisy Mexican community of Vickham where Benny lived and the Yaqui settlements. Shall I turn right? Carlos asked as we drove through the underbrush. Ease, turn here, Benny said, pointing out the window. Is that the mesquite tree where I go left? Ease, go left, Benny replied. Do you think the mask maker will be at home? I asked. He's always in, said Benny. If not, we'll go to the store. I tried to figure out why Benny was prefacing all his replies with ees. I thought it might be some sort of Spanish expletive used in that part of Sonora, or perhaps a Yaqui word. As we were waiting for Benny to return from a quick trip to the bushes, I asked Carlos what ees meant. Benny uses it every time he says something, I said. Carlos laughed. He's saying yes in English. Benny is trying to learn English. Converse with him a little. Don't be shy. When Benny came back, I asked him what the Yaquis sold in their stores. Saddles and canned goods, he said, coffee and sugar and Coca-Cola. Wherever there was a store, Benny said he knew of it and he intended to take us to all of them. Where are all the women? I asked, having passed only men on the road. Inside their houses, Benny replied. They don't come out unless they have a reason, like getting water from the well, or wood for the fires, or to get supplies from the store. I can't believe there is a store around here, I said. I could see nothing but low-roofed adobes and desert vegetation. We go there now to look for masks, Benny explained. We followed a dirt road that was rutted from the rains, until we came to a mud house, like all the other structures of the area, only perhaps a bit longer. Sacks of grain were piled against one wall. It had no windows, only a door painted turquoise. Several tall Yaqui Indians were standing near the entrance, others were sitting on a plank bench drinking orange and lime sodas. All had on sombreros to shade themselves from the noonday sun. Some men had mustaches and were older, others were young boys in their teens, and, as usual, there were no women. Carlos parked the car and I followed him and Benny into the store. I was surprised to see a variety of merchandise. There was a long counter, and on the walls were shelves stocked with canned goods as well as sacks of flour, sugar, and coffee. One section of the store was devoted to tools and light farm equipment, such as ropes, spades, tools, and other implements. Benny talked to the proprietor, with whom he seemed to be on friendly terms. After a while, the man left through a curtained door leading into a back room. He has a few masks in the back, Carlos said to me. He's going to bring them out for us to look at. Benny opened the cooler and pulled out several sodas which we sipped, while we waited for the man to return. When I looked up, I noticed a girl behind the counter staring at me. She must have come out from the back room because she had not been in the store when we entered, and I was certain she hadn't come through the front door. She had short curly dark hair and beautiful delicate features. She couldn't have been more than 17. Her skin was smooth and brown, and she had the biggest black eyes I had ever seen. Carlos started to talk to her. They spoke in such hushed voice that I could barely hear them, but I could tell from their serious expressions that the two were discussing something important. The girl seemed on the verge of tears. Carlos was trying to console her. He put an arm around her and patted her head. Finally, the girl turned to me and gave me a look of hatred that could make the blood of a lizard curdle, then she slipped through the curtain into the back room. Before I could ask Carlos who the girl was, the owner of the store came back holding 3 carved wooden masks and laid them on the counter. They were masks used by the dancers during the Pascola celebrations. They were painted black with red markings around the eyes and across the cheeks. Bleached horsehair formed a fringe of bangs over the forehead and served as eyebrows, while longer strands of horsehair hung down the front of the mask like a goatee or beard. Around the rims were carved triangles and circles. 2 had a cross on the forehead, the third mask had a lizard painted on each cheek. Carlos bargained about the price, for the man did not seem to want to part with all 3 masks. When Benny started to leave, dragging us with him to show that we were not interested, the man agreed to sell and I saw money changing hands. On the way out we passed some hats hanging on a rack. Carlos tried a few on until he found one that fit him, which he left on his head. Benny took his worn hat off and put on a new one. "Pick one out," Carlos said to me. No one in Sonora goes without a hat. The first one I put on seemed to fit, but there was no mirror in the store to see how it looked. I caught my reflection on the side of a stainless steel thermos on the counter. I liked it. I looked less of a foreigner with a sombrero on. Carlos paid for the hats and sodas. The owner walked out with us, and when I looked back, I saw the girl standing in the doorway watching us. For a moment I felt sorry for her. Her options seemed dismally limited. She could marry one of the young men who were standing outside the store admiring her, and then spend her life looking after him and their children. Most likely she would never go more than 10 miles out of the area. Perhaps she would visit a relative in one of the neighboring towns for a wedding or a birthday, and their exchange gossip about the latest birth or mourn over someone who had recently died. Or, if she were lucky, she might get a job as a maid in one of the motels in Ciudad Obregón or Guaymas. In short, the girl's future was sealed in the grimmest way. A crow's loud cawing from a nearby cottonwood tree caught me by surprise. I remember another time when I was having a similar mental dialogue concerning a woman who had served us in the restaurant in Santa Ana, but who had turned out to be a cure. I had been wrong then, and from the way the girl had glared at me, I felt I was wrong again. I watched the girl through the side mirror as Carlos and Benny talked to the owner and some of the young men standing by the door. One of them seemed to be giving Carlos directions, for he was pointing off into the distance to the east. I sensed that the girl was looking at Carlos with what I could only call admiration or fondness. It struck me then that the girl was in love with him. I felt a pang of jealousy which I immediately tried to hide by smiling at Carlos as he got in the car. As we drove off, leaving Benny to talk with some friends he had run across, I watched the girl watching us until we disappeared behind the dust and shrubs. "Who is that girl?" I asked as we continued down the dirt road. Dust was getting in my eyes and made me sneeze. For a moment Carlos was silent. "That's Josefina," he finally said. "Don't you remember?" The name was so familiar. Suddenly, my ears popped and I remembered where I had seen her. She was the girl that had accosted me in Zuleika's house. "She's a sorceress," I gasped. "What's she doing here? And don't tell me she's helping out the owner of the store, like that woman in the restaurant in Santa Ana." "No, she just came for some supplies." "You mean she lives around here?" Again a long silence. "She seems to like you a lot," I said. "Have you known her long? What were you two whispering about in there?" Carlos shrugged. "She wants me to take her to the United States," he said. "I'm teaching her English." For an instant I lapsed into a familiar moroseness. I was certain Carlos was teaching her English so he could bring her to the United States. Missing page numbered 150 from original scan. The self. These feelings of love and hate, jealousy, or envy did not simply go away by changing one's venue. They were deeply rooted, buried in every cell of our being. To rid ourselves of these feelings, we would have to do more than to recapitulate our lives. We would, in Zuleika's words, have to become transformed. The car reached the highway with a thud. I was relieved to see Carlos smiling. Perhaps he wasn't attached to the girl in the store after all. I breathed easier and lost myself watching the shadows and colors the sun cast on the desert landscape as we drove to Don Felipe's, the mask maker's house. His house had a wooden cross in the courtyard and was situated on the edge of a cultivated field. It was more spacious than the other houses I had seen, and it was built of good adobe bricks and the dirt around it was clean and well packed. Carlos asked me to wait in the car while he talked with Don Felipe, but I insisted on going inside. Don Felipe introduced us to his wife, who immediately left the room, as if she were too shy to speak to strangers. Don Felipe was elderly, tall, and had a sense of quietude about him. His eyes were not bright and burning, but rather distant, as if looking off somewhere into another world. I suspected he read Spanish, for he had several books on a shelf. In his conversational manner he projected a simplicity and intelligence. He seemed knowledgeable on many subjects. At one point, I sensed the discussion centered on the Ram Chronicle and some of the legendary heroes of Yaqui history, for I heard the names of Calixto Muni, Kajim, Tatabiate and Juan Bandera repeatedly mentioned. Carlos had told me earlier that Calixto Muni was an 18th-century Yaqui leader who had organized the Yaquis into a military unit to fight the Mexicans. Juan Bandera, who claimed to have had a vision of the Virgin of Guadalupe, also organized military units of Yaquis under a flag of the Virgin. Tatabiate, after Kajim's defeat, reorganized the remnants of the Yaqui forces in the mountains north of the Yaqui River, and waged guerrilla warfare against Mexicans for many years. I sensed Don Felipe didn't want to sell Carlos any masks, but when Carlos said that he was working with Don Juan, whom Don Felipe seemed to know, he got up and went into the back room and brought out a mask wrapped in a red cloth. He carefully unfolded the cloth to reveal a mask unlike the ones that we had found in the store. This mask was really spooky. It was unpainted and had no horsehair trim. The facial features were distorted as if in a snarl. The mouth was open, the eyes were slightly slanted, one higher than the other. The wood was white with layers of natural swirls in its grain. It was beautiful, yet at the same time, awesome. Carlos thanked Don Felipe and we left. "Why is that mask so different?" I asked, walking to the car. "That's a mask of an ally," Carlos said. "The other masks are for the Pascola dancers." Carlos carefully put the mask in the trunk after wrapping it in a towel for protection. "What's an ally?" I asked, trying to think if Clara or John Michael Abelar had ever discussed that topic. "An ally is a force that exists outside the world of ordinary perception," Carlos said. "That force can take any shape when in service of the sorcerer." "You mean anything can be an ally?" I asked. "No, they are specific entities that are formless, but they can take the shape of anything they wish to emulate, depending on the energy that they harness from the human world." "Have you ever seen one?" I asked. Don Juan showed me his ally on several occasions and nearly frightened me to death. Once I had to wrestle with it and thought I was done for. "Is it like a ball of energy? Sizzling and kind of bluish?" "It could be a man, a gigantic black door, a ferocious animal, anything, but, yes, it's full of sizzling energy." I told Carlos about a series of recurring dreams I had had, of at least I thought they were dreams. I was staying in Clara's house in the beautiful room she had assigned to me. I would just be drifting off to sleep when I heard noises outside my door in the hallway. At first, I thought it was footsteps, someone big walking down the corridor. Terrified, I put my head under the covers and hoped the noises would go away. But they didn't. Sometimes there was some scratching at the door, as if a huge animal was prowling outside trying to get in. In my semi-sleep state, I would get up and push a heavy dresser in front of the door so that nothing could get in, but to no avail. The force, or whatever was behind the door, would be so fearsome strong that the dresser would move aside, pushed by a sizzling energy. I'd just stand there petrified watching the antique dresser moving away from the door, and seeing the door itself bulging inward toward me with a tremendous force, about to bust off his hinges. I would either run back to my bed and hide, preferably under it, or I would stand there so petrified that I was unable to move. I remembered trying to scream, but nothing came out of my mouth. Sometimes I would wake up panting, soaked in perspiration, or I would wake up on the floor in front of the door, partly covered by the dresser. My heart would be pounding so strongly that it would take hours to quiet down. These encounters became so recurring that I told Clara about them. "That force is nothing to sneeze at," she said seriously. "You say the door is about to burst off its hinges. Watch out. Whatever is prowling out there is about to come in." "What will happen if it does?" I asked. "Will I die?" "Who can tell," she said. "That force is determined to get you." "Why is it after me?" I asked. "What did I do wrong?" In my mind, I ran the gamut of all the sins of commission and omission, and there were plenty of them. "It's not what you didn't do," she said, shaking her head pathetically. "It's what you did do. You've been doing your sorcery passes, especially the one where you grab the imaginary sliding door and pull it open. That's the one that started this whole thing, and that's the one that may save you in a pinch." "What kind of pinch are you talking about, Clara? Will the force really come after me?" "You bet your boots. I'd say it's about to burst through the door any moment now, and when it does, you're going to have to put up a fight." I felt my stomach sink right there. "I'd rather flee than fight," I said. "I'm a coward. I only pretend to be tough, and sometimes I don't even pretend well." Clara looked me up and down groggily and shook her head. "You only say you're a coward out of habit," she remarked. "You're tougher than you let on." "Let me be the judge of that, Clara," I insisted. "And I say when it comes to nightmarish forces, I'm a coward." She laughed and sighed resigned. "Have it your way, Taisha, it really doesn't matter what you are. The thing that counts is what you do when the force comes through that door." "What should I do?" I asked. "You grab it like this, and shake it like a huge Turkish towel." She demonstrated by holding up her two fists as if she were grabbing something in mid-air and began flinging her arms up and down wildly, thrashing about as if she were holding something invisible that was unstoppable in its fury. "Keep hold of it," she warned. "Don't you dare let go, no matter how hard it thrashes you about." Right there I knew I was lost, but my rational mind needed to know the very worst that could happen, so I asked, "What will happen if I let go?" She stopped her bizarre gyrations and looked me in the eye. Her expression was cold and ominous. "The ally will gobble you up," she said. "It likes tender little cowards," and then she made the most ominous biting noises with her teeth, as she said, "Yum, yum, yummy, yum, yum," over and over. As Clara went on with her yummy, yum, yums, she rubbed her stomach and patted her head at the same time in opposite circles. Then I knew that one of us had lost their mind, and I wondered if it wasn't me. I had decided then and there to disregard her advice as bordering on the absurd, and, to my relief, I didn't have the encounter again the rest of that week, but the following week, right before my menstrual period, I felt the force again. This time, it was prowling outside my door with an increased ferocity. As I stood in front of the door, I could tell it meant business by the fierce white light that was bursting under the door and through the cracks on the sides, cracks that were getting larger as the sturdy door was being pushed away from its hinges. I didn't even have time to run to my bed. The door burst aside, or rather was snapped off, and flung to the side, and I was face to face with a most blinding white light that was the size of the door frame. I was petrified, frozen to the core. I couldn't scream or breathe. As it began advancing toward me, I was about to faint. Then, I realized that this sizzling glob of light was absolutely conscious and aware. Before I passed out, I heard in my ear Clara's voice saying "yummy yum yum" over and over. I had a moment of decision, of either getting rolled over by the boulder of light, or of grabbing it and shaking it like Clara had shown me. Some force inside me rallied, and in spite of myself, I instinctively lurched forward, diving into the ball of light head on like one would dive into a huge wave in the sea. I knew I would be electrocuted, fried to a crisp as when throwing a hairdryer into the bathtub, but to my amazement, the electricity was not hot at all. The sizzling was cool, yet tremendously forceful. I grabbed onto it and hung on with all my might as it thrashed me about, first from side to side as it tried to shake me off, then in circles, as we rolled on the floor. I felt as if I were tumbled by a wave on the ocean bottom. Its force was so strong that I lost consciousness, but something in me kept on grabbing. Then, gradually, the force seemed to diminish. It became stiffer, rigid, then more flaccid, having lost much of its sizzling quality. It became flat and spongy, then almost vaporous, until it evaporated altogether and I was left on the floor holding on to nothing. I took a deep breath and, perspiring, walked to my bed. All I could think of was, what the hell was that? When I woke up the next morning, I told Clara what had happened. She no longer seemed interested. "Now, they won't bother you again," was all she said. You'd be surprised how word gets around on the energetic plane. Forces know that they have another thing coming if they mess with Taisha. "What forces are those?" I asked Clara. She said it was just a force that permeated the universe, bundles of energy, aware and predatory, like everything else in existence. Remembering the encounter gave me the shivers. I moved closer to Carlos in the front seat, so my arm touched his. We drove back to Vickham Station in complete silence.